Hello, and welcome to the Moss Adams presentation of performing government contract audits without the DCAA. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping items we'd like to cover with you to make your time with us more enjoyable.
Moss Adams is pleased to present another in our ongoing series of continuing professional education webcasts. Our presentation will start in a few moments. Before we begin, here are a few things to keep in mind. You can customize both how you view our presentation and how you interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can also adjust window size and placement. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons, each relating to a different aspect of our session. For example, you can click the file folder icon to download the group attendance sheet and a PDF copy of today's slides. You can ask our presenter questions during the webcast by clicking Q&A in the bottom left-hand portion of the icon bar and typing in your question. We'll do our best to answer all questions during the presentation or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty during today's presentation, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. We'll ask polling questions throughout today's presentation. Per the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy webcast CPE standards, CPE credit will be awarded based on your participation in these polls. To respond to a poll, click the button next to your answer. If you're attending this webcast in a group, in order to receive CPE credit, you must complete our attendance sheet, available in the file folder icon at the bottom of your screen. Please have all group members sign the sheet, and please remit only one sheet per group. Also note, today's session will offer you one CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the requirements as specified by the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy. CPE credit can be awarded only to participants registered as themselves and is not available to participants who view the on-demand version. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon to open a PDF file you can save to your computer. We'll email a copy of your PDF certificate in 2 weeks if you can't download it today. As a reminder, the presentation you're about to see is not legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
It's my very great pleasure to introduce our speakers today who take a topic, the government contracting topic, that can be very, very convoluted, very, very confusing, and make it interesting. They make it exciting. They make it easy to understand. I want to start by introducing Curtis Matthews. Curtis is the leader of the federal contract compliance practice here at Moss Adams. He brings more than 30 years of experience in federal and state program controls and audits. Prior to joining Moss Adams, he served as an auditor with the Defense Contract Audit Agency, where he audited hundreds of proposals and helped contracting officers establish negotiation positions. He also directed internal audit services for PricewaterhouseCoopers and managed global business process and technology improvement projects for Intel Corporation. Curtis helps federal contractors and federal agencies address their substantial compliance challenges in meeting their audit requirements. And as a former federal auditor, he brings in valuable insights into the DCAA audit environment. Joining Curtis is Jeff Witt. Jeff is among the leadership of the federal contract compliance practice, and he brings over 25 years of relevant experience in leading government compliance consulting engagements, including assisting clients with developing policies and procedures and controls for compliance with federal acquisition regulations. Jeff's value to his clients is his comfort in working with the wide variety of audit types and addressing the unique requirements of each. Prior to joining Moss Adams, Jeff was a lead auditor for the DCAA for over 10 years and a controller for a large government contractor. Jeff is a speaker, an educator, and an advocate for government contracting. Welcome to the program, gentlemen.
Well, thank you all for joining us today. We look forward to a lively discussion around the changes that have occurred as a result of the National Defense Authorization Act. So today we're going to cover, let me push out the, so Tanya, I don't know which slides are up. And I want to make sure that the people here have the agenda slide. Can you make sure that's...
I'll forward it to that slide. There we go.
Okay. So essentially we're going to cover the changes that have resulted from the National Defense Authorization Act. We're going to cover non-DoD and agency prime contractor audit responsibilities, go into some details of the Act. We'll also cover non-Defense Department impacts from reduced Defense Audit Agency support, and we'll give you key takeaways. So that's our agenda. We are going to fall through on every single item that's there. The key changes, related to the DCAA as a whole. Okay, so this is a kind of a broader perspective on changes of the DCAA. There are changes related to the Defense Authorization Act, in that coverage of non-Department of Defense DoD agencies is no longer DCAA responsibility. But there are also other changes in terms of areas of emphasis by the DCAA, where the DCAA focus will be for defense agencies, for under the Department of Defense. There are also tighter interpretations of the rules around allowable and unallowable costs. So the DCAA for Defense Department contracts is also, putting more emphasis on projecting losses included in G&A rates as they look at rates. So there's actually a lot of changes in their approach. They're also sampling more in terms of how they're approaching defense contracts. So broadly, the DCAA's approach to working with agencies and working with contractors is changing. But particularly today, we're going to talk essentially on this big change regarding DCAA support for non-DoD agencies. So with that, a lot of the agencies are grappling with, and contractors that have to perform audits on subcontractors are really grappling with, well, what do we need to cover? What's leaving us? What are we no longer getting support for? How are we going to get the support we need to perform our audits? This is the big problem and challenge, obviously. It's kind of an obvious one that's out there as a result of this. And one of the things that often gets missed when organizations are first looking at this is the fact that the DCAA provides a wide number of required audits, and not just incurred cost audits. As a rule, we're talking with agencies and talking with other organizations. There's a lot of focus around the indirect rate audits, the incurred cost audits, and those types of audits that the DCAA is performing. Then quickly, agencies and organizations are picking up on the fact that terminations are still occurring, delay claims are still occurring, so there's claim audits that the DCAA had provided support for that they're not now. So now we're seeing situations. We recently came across a situation with the Corps of Engineers where there was a termination claim that's basically not getting settled because there's no audit support for it, and you really need that audit support to properly settle a termination claim. As the majority, I think the vast majority of the people on the call are experienced in working with federal contracting and know that there's a need for audit support in all of these areas. So that's kind of the main point of what we're trying to get across here is there's a wide variety of audits you really need to think about. And particularly on cost type contracts, that second bullet there under FAR 42.703, a single agency is responsible for establishing final indirect rates for a business unit, the contractor. So if you're, so once that's done, essentially, once it's established which single agency is going to be responsible for those final indirect rate audits, or indirect rates, I should say, there's a requirement for an audit to be conducted, and that's essentially, on cost type contracts seems to be the biggest issue that that organizations are struggling with. And they're struggling with it from the standpoint of they're no longer getting audit support, but they're also struggling with it from the standpoint of they have not been getting audit support. The DCAA is way behind in the audits that it's been responsible to be conducting, and that's a part of the Defense Authorization Act as well, actually. It's considered in the Act. And so essentially, not only is there no audit support, the audit support's being cut off, but there's also the issue of the fact that they're behind. So there's a lot of years of contracts that need to be closed out. There's some pretty significant implications to all of this. And when you think about the implications to an agency, these implications can be, significant noncompliance risk. There can be reputation implications, especially when the Inspector General groups, they continue to do their audits, they continue to publish their reports. The government as a whole, the elected officials are quite interested in those reports. The press is interested in those reports. There's significant fiscal impacts from not closing out contracts and utilizing funds that are available when they were to be used. There's issues associated with contracting. There are a lot of non-compliance impacts, and all this, comes to bear. We're in a situation where there's no longer audit support that is required. So with that, we have polling questions here. It's important to answer them in order for you to get your CPE for participating in the webinar today. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tanya to help you with the questions here.
Thank you, Curtis. So which FAR clause requires agencies to establish final indirect rates related to the cost type contracts they have issued? And we generally try to give you about 15 or 20 seconds to select the answer and then be sure and press your submit button so your answer is recorded. I do know that we have quite a few folks joining us today in a classroom setting, so we want to be sure and get the questions captured today so we can issue you credit for this. So, as a reminder too, is if you have asked questions, we will likely save them till the end, but please don't hesitate to ask, and we'll be sure and get them addressed as well. So we'll give that just another few seconds, and I'll go ahead and close the polls.
Okay, well, the correct answer is FAR 42.703. But, if you got it right, you got a great memory. So, good job. So let's move on to the next slide here. And I'd like to turn it over to you, Jeff, to maybe talk about this one, if you would.
Sure.
I think we need to go back one.
Yeah, I think we need to go back one.
Yeah. Go ahead.
There we go. Okay. So 4.804-5 is referring to FAR 4.804-5. And so the purpose of this slide is to discuss what is the regulatory requirement for having audits conducted. And if you, as an agency, were to be evaluated by the Office of Inspector General, for example, this is what they're going to be looking at and citing you for in terms of whether you've met your responsibility as an agency. It would be under FAR 4.804-5. Because one of those requirements, among other requirements, is that a contract audit is completed. And if the IG were to find that there were contracts being closed without these audits, and that could be an incurred cost audit, or it could be another kind of audit depending upon the circumstances, then that would be the basis for them to, write a negative report about your agency. So that's, an important thing to note. That's why we're here. We're trying to help companies and agencies understand the regulatory requirements and how they can meet them, and this is one of the key regulatory requirements. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. There we go. So important questions regarding whether an audit is sufficient. So as we try to scope out our audits that we perform, there's some key areas that we always consider, and that really any audit organization should be thinking about. So does the audit consider risk factors, including the contract type, prior audit coverage, prior audit findings, adequacy of controls for segregation of unallowable costs, and for correct allocation of costs? So does the audit apply sound statistical and non-statistical sampling methods? We find that the agencies that we're working with are very interested in the sampling methods that we're utilizing, and they're asking us to put that in our report so they can see how did we sample under these, because they need to meet their requirements to be able to say that an adequate audit was done. And does the audit team possess the skills and experience to correctly apply applicable auditing standards, including generally accepted government auditing standards? So we see sometimes where that might be done by internal personnel within the agency that may or may not have that skill set, or they may reach out to a CPA firm, and the CPA firm may or may not have that skill set. So it's not something you can dabble in. It's something that you really need to have a deep skill set in to be able to do these audits correctly. Is the audit team independent in fact and appearance? And what is that report going to look like? Is it going to be a GAGAS compliant audit report? We wanted to mention the mandatory annual audit requirements. So any of you that might have heard of the Defense Contract Audit Agency will know what these MARs are all about. It's kind of like one of the cornerstones to the agency's approach to performing audits, and incurred cost audits in particular. And so any audit that's conducted, especially an incurred cost audit, is going to want to consider these types of MARs, because the agencies, even if they're not using DCAA anymore, there's still a long history of audits being done by DCAA, and there's this thing called the DCAA Contract Audit Manual that includes these MARs as a key requirement for an adequate audit. So it's not something that's going to go away just because DCAA may not be doing the audits. These are kind of key elements of an audit, including reconciliation of general ledger to the claim, payroll labor distribution reconciliation, indirect cost comparisons, analysis, and just a number of key fundamental steps. And it's important because the IG, again, will be evaluating whether the audit work that was done meets applicable standards and also these key requirements. So we know that we have a number of people from the Department of Interior on the call, and so we thought it might be good to put in a slide or two specific to that situation. We thank you for being here, and the situation I think there is that your agency provides a significant contract and grant awards to a lot of different types of organizations. You've got state and local governments you might be giving grants to. You've got tribal governments. You've got nonprofit organizations. You've got for-profit organizations. You may have hospitals that are involved. So what we know is that there's different standards that apply to each of these different types of organizations, or there has been, and we want to go into that with a little bit of detail because I think it provides a good framework and a good example of the complexity that's out there, that as you're addressing these audits, you need to understand, you need to have an audit organization that really understands this complexity and can apply the right standards and the right cost principles when conducting these audits. So the audits also should apply the mandatory annual audit requirement steps that we discussed previously. So continuing with this discussion of Department of Interior examples. So with nonprofit organizations in the past, they used to be subject to OMB Circular A122. Universities were subject to OMB Circular A21. Tribal organizations and state and local governments to Circular A87. And then any for-profit entities would generally be subject to Federal Acquisition Regulation Part 31. So a big change that happened recently was the move to the uniform guidance, whereas awards made on or after December 26, 2014 are now subject to the uniform guidance in most cases. So those things that were all subject to different circulars are now covered within the uniform guidance for nonprofits, universities, and tribal organizations. You also had hospitals that were subject to 45 CFR Part 74, and they continue to be subject to that separate set. They would like to bring it into the uniform guidance, but there's some differences there that prevented them from incorporating it in the uniform guidance. And even within the uniform guidance, there are then carve-outs for the rules that relate to specific types of entities. For example, tribal organizations have a section within the uniform guidance for some specific rules that apply there. So you can have a situation, as we often do, that you're auditing multiple years, and you could easily have a situation where some of those years are subject to some regulations, and other years, depending upon the date, are subject to other rules. And so it makes it a complex situation to do an audit when part of that audit may be subject to Circular A87, for example, and part of it may be subject to the uniform guidance. You also run into, even for-profit entities, if they're receiving grants or they're a subrecipient on a grant, that they may be subject to some of the elements of the uniform guidance in addition to the FAR Part 31 requirements that they're subject to. So our point here is that, as an agency, being able to pass an IG audit with regards to how you've implemented audits to meet your responsibilities as an agency requires understanding this complexity and engaging with audit organization that understands this complexity so that you can pass with flying colors when the OIG comes to pay you a visit. All right, so moving on. We want to talk a little bit about FAR 42.202. If you're a prime contractor, this is the regulation that makes you responsible, among others, for managing and auditing your subcontracts. So this includes proposal audits, systems adequacy audits, incurred cost audits. So as a prime contractor with subcontractors, this is creating that obligation on your part. And of course, as an agency, you're responsible to ensure the prime has done its job and is meeting these obligations under the FAR. So because of the situation with the National Defense Authorization Act that Curtis is going to talk about in just a second, this is creating, more requirements for both the prime contractor and the agency to address these audits in the absence of DCAs being able to do that any longer. So with that, I'm going to pass the torch back over to Curtis to talk about the NDAA.
Yeah, and with the NDAA, as Jeff was talking about the prime contractors, of course, agencies have a responsibility to make sure the prime contractors are doing what they should be. So there are pretty wide implications of these audit requirements. This is just a excerpt from the NDAA, just pointing out some of the key provisions of it, restriction on performing audits for non-DoD agencies, so those are restricted. Basically, the focus of the DCAA will be on Defense Department type contracts, and essentially that's to occur until the DCAA solves its backlog problem that we talked about earlier, and we haven't seen that in, I don't know if it's been my lifetime, but it's been a long time, but it's been an extremely long time. So and we don't really think that's going to change in the near future. So, we have to, the agencies have to find alternative means of conducting its audits, and the prime contractors need to get that audit support that they need as well. So with that, we have another polling question. So I'd like to have you answer this one.
So complete this sentence. Section 893 of the 2016 National Defense Authorization Act restricts DCAA from performing audits, is it of low-risk contractors, of closed contracts, of non-DoD agency contracts, unless requested by the administrative contracting officer, all of the above, or none of the above. Be sure and press submit so your answer is recorded. And we'll just give that another few seconds. We'll go ahead and close the polls and take a look at our results.
Good work. The percentages here are kind of interesting on this polling result, but bottom line is the vast majority of you got it right. The NDA restricts audits on non-DoD agencies. Next, along the lines of talking about the NDA and some of the backlog issues, we just thought we'd point out some of these facts in regard to the DCAA and kind of where they've been at. I think the second bullet is pretty telling. There's an 18-month backlog with 11,250 proposals. That's pretty astounding. And, of course, the volume of 7,500 proposals per year is pretty amazing as well. The dollar backlog is significant. $419 billion needs to be reviewed, and 6,861 are awaiting receipt of an adequacy determination, adding up to $403 billion. I mean, the numbers are just astronomical when you think about it. The backlog and how far behind the audits are. But yet, the OIG is right there for you to come in and do their audits and make sure you're complying. So, with that in mind, we thought we'd give you an example here. We have a couple of examples, actually. This is from the Department of Energy. And essentially, the OIG is definitely not letting up. They're calling the agency on, the audits that have been done or not done, and they're also addressing the quality of the audits that are being done, and that creates, a lot of angst on the part of the leadership of the agency. With the DOE, their approach to it is, really to address the risks related to it. So basically, there's a risk of increased, payment of unallowable costs. There's a risk of, we've seen this where with this backlog, in some cases, the subcontractors, we know that they have a 3-year record retention period for cost data, and the audits are so far behind, and organizations that were even like prime contractors that should have been doing the audits are so far behind, and so the agencies and the prime contractors are somewhat at fault. That as a result of that, the subcontractors aren't required. They're supposed to be audited, aren't required to keep the records to be audited. So then, when the organization that's performing the audit needs to go in and do its work, the subcontractor says, well, we don't maintain those records anymore. We didn't have to, and you can't do your audit. And we have seen that like in a number of instances where you just can't even conduct the audit because things are so far behind. And that puts everyone in an awkward situation because you basically, when that happens, you have to still close out the contract, and you have to know at what amount to close out the contract, yet you have had no audit conducted. So that puts the contracting officer in an extremely awkward position because you don't have good support to be able to close out your contract. It puts the the auditee in an awkward position too, because basically there isn't sufficient support for the amount that they're getting paid underneath their contract. So it's really critical to have increased diligence around these contracts and get these audits done on time. With this, basically the Department of Energy has adopted two, I think there's like two key recommendations that have come from the audit by the OIG that the Department of Energy has basically adopted, and that's that one is the agency has to have an audit approach to ensure sufficient coverage, and it's definitely, the agency's definitely determined what that would be. Like any type of policy of this nature or procedure that's going to be implemented, the approach is refined periodically, and it'll be updated. But they have an approach that they're taking to this. And Department of Energy has an approach they're taking, and to the audits that need to be done. And the agency also is very strict about making sure that its contracting officers verify that the audits meet the requirements of professional standards, and they have high expectations. In fact, some of the work that we do is the result of others who have conducted these audits, and the audits were rejected by the agency. So then the agency had to find another source, literally, really ultimately it comes to the agency, had to find another source to conduct the audit, and our team of former DCAA auditors had the opportunity to go out and conduct those audits. So, we're all about, having strict guidance be applied to the audits, and, but basically it's something that you all need to be aware of, because that can easily happen. You can be, if your audits, and it's easy to, honestly, it's easy to tell if an audit is done in accordance with professional standards or not, basically almost by looking at the surface of the audit, by the report. But then when you dig underneath the audit and find out what's in it, how well the findings are supported, if it was done in a manner that's consistent with the contract audit manual guidance and consistent with what the expectations have been out there for many years for contract audits, government contract audits, then, it just, if it meets all that, then great. But if it doesn't meet all that, you just end up with a nightmare in trying to close your contract. You have to bring other people in to go do the audit. It's not a good place to be. So with that, I'd like to turn the time over to Jeff here.
Thank you, Curtis. So we're going to continue talking a little bit more about the Department of Energy, and they're interesting because they were somewhat of an early adapter in this process. A lot of agencies really didn't weren't thinking too much about another source besides DCAA until the NDAA happened. DOE for years, as you can see by these reports we're discussing, has been grappling with the lack of adequate audit coverage by DCAA and how they were going to address it. So we can see that prior slide was back in a 2013 OIG report, and they continued with this February 2015 OIG report on incurred cost audit coverage. So the conditions that were cited there, and this is all before the NDAA, so this is the problem before DCAA stopped doing any audits for them, but even when they were doing audits, DCAA was unable to meet the audit needs of DOE, was one of the conditions cited. DCAA had been using a low-risk sampling approach where they basically excluded 80% of the DOE non-M&O or management and operating contracts from automatic audits. So the majority of those contracts were just not being audited by DCAA, and DCAA's philosophy was if they included them in a sample population that they could have sampled from, and if they didn't pick them, then that indicates that you can go ahead and close the contract. Well, most agencies were not happy with that because for some very large contracts, there was no audit work being done, and the agency is still responsible for meeting its regulatory requirements to have an audit done. So the DCAA's kind of Hail Mary approach to try to get caught up was presenting some real problems even back then for agencies because it just wasn't covering, it wasn't meeting the regulations. So OIG recommendations at that point was to coordinate with the DCAA to develop a risk-based approach to reduce the backlog, to follow NASA and others to tailor DCAA low-risk samples. We'll talk about NASA in a second in regards to their recent history and what they've been doing to try to meet their obligations, and to develop a strategy to supplement the DCAA audit coverage where they're just simply not having the audits done that they needed. And this was all before the NDAA. One of the options there was to hire outside firms to perform independent incurred cost audits. And one of the things, as we mentioned over here, is that those costs would be valid contract costs in general, just like any other legitimate costs needed to accomplish the work on the contract. So with that, I'm going to move on to the next slide, and we have a question.
So per the DOE OIG report on incurred cost audit coverage, DCAA low-risk sampling excludes what percentage of the DOE non-M&O contracts from automatic audit? Is it 25%, 50%, 80%, or 100%? In just a few more seconds, and we'll go ahead and close those polls and take a look at our results. Nice.
All right. Well, thank you for those responses. The majority have the correct answer. It was 80%. So thanks for listening. We're going to continue now to talk more about the DOE and what updated guidance that they provided as a result of all the DOE IG surveillance that they were receiving. There's the DOE IG Audit Handbook that provides a chapter on contractor audit guidance and sample audit programs for contractors. There's the DOE Acquisition Guide that now provides a chapter on subcontract audit procedures. So they're trying to be proactive in developing a solution to this problem. Now I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about NASA, as we mentioned. Another interesting example of an agency that's, this is kind of the history there. There was a sampling that was done where they reviewed 213 instruments, which included purchase, delivery, and task orders, fixed price contracts, cost type contracts, interagency agreements, and grants and cooperative agreements. And so there's a total that they reviewed of 213. Out of that, the number that were closed late was 101. So almost half of the instruments were closed late. And I think the root cause of that could probably be traced to lack of timely audits that they needed to have done before they could close those out. So they've been aware for years that this is a problem at NASA. Statistical sample of 5,200 closed instruments during fiscal year 2013. So there was a projected excess funds of $17 million due to late deobligation. So there's definitely a financial impact of not being able to close these instruments on a timely basis. So this was all prior to the NDAA, when DCAA was still theoretically supporting NASA, and even with that, they were not able to close about half of those instruments. So here's an example of the agency response. NASA OIG issued a special report on award closeout process and incurred cost coverage. So the conditions include that NASA centers had inconsistent closeout procedures, the personnel were not dedicated to and diligent in the closeout process, and NASA encourages centers to use closeout contractors. So there was a contractor that they had to try to help them get some of these closed out, but at the root of it, if there wasn't an audit done, then that closeout contractor really couldn't close them out anyway. But the risk to NASA is increased risk of paying unallowable, unreasonable, and unallocable incurred costs. If they were to let those audits not happen and they try to close out the contracts without them, then of course they would be subject to the scrutiny of the IG that would say, how do you know that there were not unallowable, unreasonable, and unallocable costs that you're allowing this contractor to have? You never had the required audit done. So the risk of losing the opportunity to recoup the improper cost is an important factor that an agency has to consider. And back then, they were relying too heavily on DCAA, was their conclusion. NASA contracting officers generally waited for a DCAA audit, didn't really have another option in their minds to be able to get those audits done. And so NASA's internal controls did not account for the significant reduction in DCAA oversight of cost-type contracts. As we mentioned, DCAA, even back then, had implemented a sampling approach and were not doing a lot of the audits that were needed. So, moving on. Continuing with NASA. So the OIG Special Report on award closeout process and incurred cost coverage had these recommendations. So they suggested standardization of the closeout process agency-wide, establishment of time frames to close out the contracts, and then to revise the NASA Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement to allow independent public accounting firms to provide supplemental audit coverage. So this was kind of critical and a very proactive approach that they understood that they couldn't rely on DCAA even back then, before the NDAA, and they were developing adjustments to their regulations so that they could find alternative sources. And also to strengthen controls related to compensation reviews was another area of focus that they had. So there was a NASA procurement notice that happened in December of 2015, and noting that the NDAA passed in November of 2015, that this happened right after that. So there was the revision to the NASA FAR supplement to clarify when contracting officers can use a contractor to perform contract audit services. We think that was a very good development. There was also a change to Section 1815 there that now provides that in locations where DCAA has audit cognizance and is unable to perform those audit services, contracting officers may use a contractor to perform those. So these are great changes. I think NASA is still working to figure out how they want to do this on a contracting officer basis or more of a global approach, which I think is the direction they're heading in, trying to establish some procurement of audit services across the agency rather than having each contracting officer try to do that on their own. So other agencies may need to provide similar mechanisms is a point that I think is important, that if you do have regulations in your agency that require you to use DCAA, but now the NDAA says DCAA can't do it, well, that's kind of a catch-22 situation, and so sometimes those regulations need to be modified to reflect that reality. So I think we have another question.
Yes. So the recent revision to the NASA FAR supplement, Section 1815-404-2, provides that contracting officers can they elect to close flexibly priced contracts without audit? Can they utilize outside contractors to perform audits? Have ACO staff perform reviews prior to closeout instead of audits? Or have DCAA perform incurred cost audits when other options are not available? So, again, give you maybe another 10 seconds, 15 seconds to record your answer. And we'll go ahead and close the polls and take a look at our results.
Well, great. This one is the vast majority of you have the correct answer. Utilize outside contractors to perform audits.
So there's key takeaways from all of this, essentially. Basically, there's a reputation risk to agencies that don't comply. There's certainly a personal risk, professional risk for noncompliance with audit requirements. There are agency impacts. There's impacts on your budgets, your funding. There's impacts on prime contractors, particularly as well. I mean, a contractor that doesn't get its audits done is going to receive a poor rating from the agency. and they're likely not going to be able to do a lot more work with the federal government if they don't complete their audits. They could have their costs disallowed. They could have any number of issues associated with failure to conduct their audits and be compliant with that requirement. There are implications on both agencies and contractors. Basically, all of the above. Agencies and contractors must close out their prime contracts timely, and the subcontractors must be closed out timely. Everyone, I think, on the call can appreciate the importance of that. And then, of course, there's the issue associated with unaudited costs and whether it should be allowable or not. And we did, we just kind of like to go over some of the key takeaways here from our discussion today. And one is, due to the NDA, the DCAA will not audit the non-DoD prime and subcontracts. Each agency is developing a response, and DOE and NASA's response we went through today, where they're utilizing a variety of methods. Actually, they're using outside firms, but they're also beefing up internal resources to do some of these audits as well. And so they're taking a certain approach to assessing risk. But primarily, they're leveraging the external resources that are available to them. We had a question that came in about professional standards that are to be applied on these, on the audits. What standards should apply? And I'll try to answer it to the best of my ability, which I have a lot of experience with, actually, so it should be a pretty good answer for you. So essentially, what we see are, requests for attestation standards to be applied, AICPA attestation standards. We see requests for the use of the Red Book, the IIA standards, consulting standards. We see requests for GAGAS. And what we're seeing mostly is a gravitation away from attestation, which is more of like a financial statement type audit, to more of an audit that has been conducted by the DCAA over many years, which is essentially to provide an understanding of the contractor's compliance with its requirements for an incurred cost audit, for a proposal, for a system. Contractors have to have systems that comply with rules for procurement, pricing, for estimating, I should say, for procurement, for a variety of areas related to accounting that are audited, by the DCAA. And if a contractor is not compliant with those, then they aren't allowed to do business with the government, basically. And so the standards that most closely fit that agencies are turning to are related to the consulting standards, but also GAGAS. Particularly, GAGAS seems to be really coming up at the top, to the top of the list. And GAGAS is generally accepted government auditing standards. And basically, those standards have very strict requirements around who can conduct the audit. It has to be a firm that has a quality control system. Just can't be a fly-by-night consultant that doesn't do a review of what's going on. It has to be the people on the engagement have to have the requisite training, and they have to update that training annually. Basically it's over a 2-year period they achieve the training requirements, but there are certain specific GAGAS training requirements that have to be complied with. And then the audits themselves have to be conducted in a manner that has certain criteria laid out. I'll just name a few of them, but I won't name all of them. But basically, there has to be this risk assessment that Jeff was talking about when you go out and conduct your audits. You have to have clear objectives, beforehand, before you even get started, as to what your audit is trying to achieve, what questions it's trying to answer. There has to be clear criteria. And the criteria aspect of audits is often where we see organizations fall down. They'll hire someone to do an audit. They won't spell out clear criteria, and they won't have good support for what they did. And then, they may give a broad criteria like it may be the FAR. Like our criteria is the FAR as a whole. But, because they really don't understand that underneath, the federal acquisition regulations, there's a lot of specific regulations that you have to comply with. And so, so the criteria needs to be specific to the risk that's related to the objective that you're auditing against, and that needs to be delineated in the report. There's a need for, recommendations of management response and that type of thing as well. So when conducting a GAGAS audit, I would encourage you, if you're using that standard, I would definitely encourage you to turn to the Yellow Book and make sure that, the people you're working with meet the requirements of GAGAS. And, you can ask for simple things like provide your peer review report, which will comment on the company's system of internal control. So I just wanted to field that question.
I agree. It's an important question, and I think that it's for the agencies as they're going out to procure these services, it will be really beneficial if they're able to have a clear understanding of the standards that they're looking for. So we're seeing different RFPs, RFQs coming out to do a variety of different audits. It could be a proposal audit, incurred cost audit, could be a system audit, and we're seeing generally the statement that these will be done under GAGAS. But within GAGAS, there is Chapter 4 from the Yellow Book, which pertains to audits, where we would be expressing an opinion. There's Chapter 5, which is attestations in the Yellow Book, which could be a review, could be an examination, it could be an agreed-upon procedure. There's Chapter 6 of the Yellow Book, which is about performance audits. So those are the three chapters, and those are the kinds of audits that can be done under GAGAS. And as agencies are procuring, if they have a clear understanding of what they're asking for the various types of audits, then they're going to be really ahead of the game when it comes to evaluating that.
Yeah, and there was another question about what's the best method for, I'm reading here about the best method to use when contracting with auditors to perform this work, and what type of contract should we be using. So I think you're asking, should it be a lump sum contract, a time and materials contract, or other form of contracting. I would say that it really depends. The type of contract you choose depends on the nature of the audit that's being conducted. As a rule, time and materials contracts seem to be the most common that we're generally seeing. I don't know, Jeff, do you have any other perspective on that?
No, I agree with that.
Yeah, so that's generally what we're seeing is more time and materials for the audit services. And then there's another question here. I've got under team chat. No, I think actually that's the same question. So I think we got that one covered.
I see another question here. It says, is there anything that can be done about contracts that weren't audited by the DCAA within the 3-year time period? And so it's an interesting question because, yes, contractors may have a leg to stand on to make the case that they weren't required to keep support for longer than 3 years, but there's still some other factors involved. They still have to maintain their relationship as a contractor with the agency that they're working for, and the answer that they're unwilling to support an audit is likely going to make it less likely that they're going to be doing future work for that agency. So there are still levers to be pulled even if that 3-year time period has expired, and there's still ways to get those audits done. But yes, there is the risk that the contractor could hold firm and deny you access for that reason. But we see that in a lot of those cases, eventually we're able to get in there and do an audit. It just takes some negotiation and help them understand why that has to happen still.
Yeah, some organizations are also taking a look at the risk. That's what I've seen, particularly if they look at the risk associated with the unaudited work, which is really a bad place to be. So we're definitely encouraging everyone on the call to not be in that place. Get your audits done timely, and then you won't be in this place. But basically, sometimes you can't change what's happened. And So what some organizations have done is they've gone in and looked at the contract and they found the auditable dollars. They've assessed the risk associated with those, and then they've had to essentially have a negotiation between the agency and the contractor on the basis of risk and likelihood of overcharges, basically.
Yep.
Question unsupported cost, essentially.
Yep.
And so it's not been pretty. It's not been good, and it's certainly not a great place to be. So with that, Jeff and I are available for any questions you may have. We'd be happy to help you. We're not going to charge you if you want to call us with a question about how to approach things. We're here to help organizations navigate through these challenges. We've been doing this for a long, long time, and we appreciate the opportunity to have you allow us to share information that we hope will be of use to you as you go back to the workplace. So thank you so much for joining us today. Tanya, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much. As a reminder, please don't hesitate to reach out to our team. They love answering questions, especially unusual situations or what might have you, just helping you get your questions answered around this topic. Additionally, following the webcast, you'll receive, if you didn't have a chance to download the presentation materials today, you'll receive an email that will then allow you to do that as well. Thank you again for joining us.